You can see that. So hopefully I'm going to convince you today that active learning is a pedagogical imperative. Hannah knows, I think, very well how enthusiastic I am about active learning because we did a lot of it when she was at Sussex. I probably bored you to death with it, Hannah, sorry. But what I'm hoping to do today is just to sort of try and give you what I think is the sort of the current picture of active learning and why I think, you know, it's still really important that we do it, but there's still a lot of resistance, hopefully. I'm happy for anyone to contact me in any way. I've got my email there, my Blue Sky account, my X account, if anyone still uses that. Do get in touch if you have anything to sort of share or add or query, whatever. So let's start our story. I thought I would just throw this in just for good measure. I will be advocating active learning to the hilt today, and you might be surprised to know that actually I was very quiet when I was at college myself. I wasn't a big fan of active learning as a student. And that's very fitting with the story I'm going to tell today. But actually, one of the interesting things that I noticed when I look back at this was that my tutor had said that although I was quiet, I was quite capable of making my views known, and some things never change. That bit is still true. So I thought we'd just start by looking at what active learning actually is. I'd love to be able to start with a really precise, clear definition that everybody uses, but in fact there isn't one. Lombardi called it the curious construct. Arnolini actually suggested it encompasses about 100 different concepts and methods and approaches. And if you actually look at all the mountain of research on active learning, the claim from Doolittle and colleagues is that only about 30% provide anything like an explicit definition. The most well-used one across those tends to be the Bonwell and Eisen definition, which I have more recently modified slightly. So I have a book coming next year, which is all about active learning. And in that, I argue we need to change the Bonwell and Eisen definition a little. So a pedagogical approach that involves students in doing things with others and thinking about the things they are doing. And I think really in the age of AI, that collaborative element, working with others, is becoming more and more important. Hopefully you'll be convinced of that too. The other thing that I'm really going to sort of focus on is the idea of sort of jumping on the bandwagon. I'm sure we've all experienced this many times in education, where a sort of a new idea comes along or an old concept is sort of revamped and everybody jumps on the bandwagon. Everybody wants to be involved in it. Everybody wants to demonstrate that they're using it. And then suddenly it just disappears. It just goes out of sight. I'd like to think active learning is not one of these sort of bandwagon ideas that we all jump on and then we forget about it in a couple of years' time. I think the evidence is suggesting active learning is growing and that it is becoming more prominent and more important as time goes on. So we'll come back to our little bandwagon later for a different reason. So why does it matter? I've just cherry picked here 2 examples of studies that really illustrate just one of the real benefits of active learning. So on the right, this is from Freeman's work in 2014. So Freeman looked at over 200 STEM courses, and the claim that was made there was that active learning methods actually reduce the failure rate. So it went from 33% down to 21.8%. And the claim was that actually active learning is a really important tool in actually enabling students to achieve. And it's not something that sort of happened way back in 2014, because there's a study that was published this year by Paul and Webb doing a very similar thing. They used something called CLASP, which is a collaborative learning, active learning approach. And they found a similar thing. So if you use active learning, particularly collaborative active learning, you can cut your failure rate in half. And I know what you're thinking, this is probably just STEM subjects. And a lot of the early research in active learning was very much focused on STEM, but it is now something that's been shown in all sorts of disciplines. So somebody called Silverman suggested it works the same way in music. As lawyers use psychology students. There was a study looking at history students. I'm going to have to remind myself now, Carini was the person who did the history one. It's just across all disciplines, it seems to have a really sort of positive, beneficial effect on achievement. And it's not just achievement. So again, I've just cherry picked just a few ideas about why else it is important. So there's a suggestion that it increases motivation, it reduces the stress of assessment, and particularly with mental health on the increase in our students. I think that's probably more important as time goes on. Alleviates anxiety, improves engagement. Work I did with Matt East, we showed that actually you can use active learning to improve time management as well. So we used a sort of structured approach to assessment where after every 2 weeks, we would give them an opportunity for formative assessment, but then they'd have a different task to try and do collaboratively or creatively. So there's all sorts of possibilities here. And interestingly, one of the most recent ones that I read suggested it improves attendance. And I know that in itself is a real issue at the moment for a lot of institutions, is trying to sort of promote student attendance in an age where they're having to work an awful lot alongside. So generally speaking, active learning, I think we can safely assume has got a whole range of benefits. And so this is really the question that I'm going to ask you to just think about, which is active learning still an option? Is it still something that we can afford to see as an option? And the reason I'm asking you just to think about that is because of the way that we are measured in terms of our performance, our outcomes, and so on. So NSS, TEF, graduate outcomes, employability, all the metrics that we use to try and assess teaching. All of these things are growing in importance. And I think one of the interesting things is if we look at what's happening globally, active learning is active learning is now becoming more of a sort of an important issue. So back in 2012, the Japanese government published a paper which identified the need to embrace active learning because they saw it as underpinning problem solving, collaboration, communication skills, all of those things that they thought were absolutely essential in the workplace. And then more recently in 2019, the European University Association, they actually published a report which advocated using and embedding active learning across all curricula. And that association has got members in 49 different countries, so it's by no means a small operation. But unfortunately, still, particularly in the UK, we still have little pockets of institutions or people who really believe active learning is something you can choose to do, that it is just an option. And hopefully what we're going to explore together is a little bit about why that might be the case and why there is still a little bit of resistance. So one of the barriers I'm just going to mention first is just the institutional barriers. We do tend to have a situation where the lecture has sort of almost been valorised as like the hallmark of university education. So we see it as Laurie Lard suggests, a cultural artefact of the university. It's one of those things that we rarely question. It's just reproduced generation after generation. And one of the sort of the big factors, I think, in accordance with Gibbs's work, is that we've sort of really gone down the road of looking at efficiency over effectiveness. So when you have a large group of students, it can be a really efficient way of teaching, is just to do a lecture. And we're not really thinking so much about how effective that might be. And one of the sort of the big issues there, of course, is just that that's very much feeding into a traditional model of sort of dissemination of information. So institutional convenience, tradition, all these things really have ingrained lectures as being the proper way to teach. And I think that is quite a difficult sort of thing to move away from. We need to really sort of rethink that. When we do, the benefits can be amazing. So this picture here is from the University of Minnesota. They actually did try to sort of kick back against these institutional ingrained ways of thinking, and they did what they called their Learning Spaces project. And a major part of that was to look at the physical space that students are learning in. And they designed active learning classrooms, which is exactly what you can see in that picture. So you can see there's rounded tables to promote collaboration and group work. There's screens dotted around the rooms, not just one screen that everyone has to look at. And the benefits that Brooks reported both in 2010 and again in 2012 were incredible. So the achievement that was obtained by students in these classrooms was greater than those who were taught in traditional lecture halls, even when it was the same instructor teaching the same syllabus. So that really did suggest that actually promoting this sort of collaborative learning, active learning, really did cause higher achievement. The students themselves reported the classrooms as being more engaging, more collaborative. It motivated them to want to learn, which I think, again, is a really important thing we often overlook. And for faculty, they felt that this sort of design pushed them to adopt active learning strategies. It wasn't as easy for them to sort of do the traditional lecture styles with this sort of layout. So because of the way that the classroom was structured, they felt they needed activities where they could move around between tables, which in turn facilitated them designing activities that fitted that style. There is just one drawback, of course, and you can probably guess what that is, which is it costs a lot of money. This particular project was done over quite an extensive period. And from what I understand is still ongoing, and that is partly due to financial constraints. So these sorts of classrooms cost a lot of money, as you can imagine, just completely revamping a learning space, new furniture, new screens, it comes at a cost. And that is, again, one of the sort of the real institutional barriers, is trying to sort of move away from things that really cost money and yet still promote active learning. And hopefully I'll convince you by the end of today that actually you don't need really expensive classrooms. They're lovely if you can afford them, but there's other ways that we can promote active learning too. Which brings us to our first little task. You just knew there would be some active learning. I've got a challenge for you all, and this is going to feed into what I'm going to show you next. But I'm going to ask you to write a haiku to describe your feelings about active learning. A haiku is a really short poem. It's got 3 lines and it's got a particular pattern of syllables. So line 1 has 5 syllables, line 2 has 7, line 3 has 5 syllables again. I've given you a little example there. Colleagues, take your turn. Active learning in short form, haiku in your hands. I'm going to start the timer. This green block will slowly disappear as our time drifts away. I'm going to give us 3 minutes. I think I've set it for 3 minutes. If you finish and you're happy to share your haiku, there is a little QR code there that you can scan, and that should enable you to add your haiku to our Padlet board. The reason for that, and you can put this on the Padlet board if you're happy to share this, is I am looking for contributions in terms of where we think active learning is going. And one of the things I'm doing across institutions is collecting haikus, because that is just a fun way to do it. So if you don't want yours to be used, please do say, but if you are happy for it to be used, please do put your name, and I will try to feed that into the publication. So I'm going to start the timer. You'll see the green bar slowly disappear, but see if you can construct your haiku describing your feelings about active learning. And once it appears, I'll explain why we're doing this. If you've done one and you've got time on your hands, you might want to do another. I think we're more than halfway through. Time is nearly running out. I'm just going to stop sharing just briefly. Does anyone feel brave enough to share their haiku and share their active efforts?
I can have a go.
Yay!
This is the first one I've written in years. Us getting stuck in, wakes up team from stupor nicely, rise and shine learning.
Oh, I like that. That's really good. Anyone else want to share their one? You got nice clapping emojis there.
I'm happy to give it a try, Wendy, but I'm not 100% sure I've got the syllables right.
Yeah, go ahead. This is
Okay.
good.
Active learning now for staff and students alike, for curious minds.
Yeah, nice. I like these. I did this activity at Durham a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, there was some really good haikus there as well. And one of the things that the deputy vice chancellor did was basically put it into ChatGPT and got it to convert their haiku into a student-friendly version. And honestly, like, the things it comes up with are just hilarious. So you can have so much fun with just little tasks like this, I use this in one of my lectures before we get started on the content, rather than just asking students, what their thoughts are. Just get them to put those thoughts into a haiku, and it can create so much fun amongst the students. They're really keen to share what they've made with each other, and it just sort of sets a nice tone, really. So it doesn't have to be complicated things. But there is another reason that I've asked you all to do that, which I will explain more about now. Hopefully you can see that. The reason that I've asked you all to do it, I feel I'm sort of preaching to the converted in some ways here, but if you weren't already interested in teaching, there are a number of faculty members who really are not big advocates of active learning. And I've called this the BFP. You've heard of BFG, I hope, from Roald Dahl. But this is the BFP, the big faculty problem. And the BFP stands for the three sort of branches of resistance in terms of faculty, because even if an institution does sort of embrace the idea of active learning, trying to convince faculty of why it's valuable or important can often be a sticking point. And the first thing is the beliefs. There is a sort of feeling that when we teach, historically, this means transmission of knowledge, that we sort of have a job to tell students what it is they need to know. And I don't think any of us are under the illusion anymore that actually the idea of a teacher as an expert is long gone. We have the internet at the touch of a button. We have AI now on top of that. Really this belief that actually our job is to just transmit knowledge is quite outdated. And I think there is more of a movement now towards seeing the role of a tutor as, supporting students in knowing how to obtain good knowledge and actually how to think critically about that and how to do things with it, how to apply it. So I think the beliefs are really ingrained, and I think historically they had value. But I think it is still one of those things that we need to be aware of. And I think a slightly bigger faculty problem is the fear, which is the F of our BFP. There is this sort of feeling quite often that if we are effective at teaching, that we can maintain control. And active learning often sort of invites that possibility of not actually maintaining control. So, for example, failing a task or feeling embarrassed or feeling that we've lost our sort of control. We're used to being the smart person in the middle of the room and all the answers. And I think one of the things we need to be aware of is that there is supposedly this epidemic at the moment of mental illness in faculty, with the pressures of workload, the financial pressures, the job instability, and the idea of faculty as pressure vessels has actually been put forward. And we do need to acknowledge that as part of this fear. Really, active learning requires us to take risks, and taking risks is something that, for all sorts of reasons, as we'll see in a moment, we're not really open to as much as perhaps we could be. So the P of our BFP is performance, and this is more about our interactions with the students. I think, the fear of disengagement is a big factor. So what if the students just don't engage? Fielder actually talked about how, for tutors, one of the big concerns with active learning is if students spend that time socialising rather than really taking the learning seriously. What if students claim they're not being taught? That was a concern that Henderson acknowledged back in 2012. And even more sort of concerning, perhaps in present time, is the student pushback. We know from all sorts of work, even looking at Desloria's work that we mentioned earlier, that students often don't feel like they learn as much in active learning classrooms, even though their tests of learning actually tell us a different story. So we are concerned about student evaluations. We're concerned about whether or not students will evaluate our teaching poorly, simply because they don't feel like they're learning the same amount as perhaps in traditional classrooms. So together these present quite a big issue. And the other sort of factor that underlines our BFP is our sort of link between what we're doing in terms of teaching and assessments, because there are several pressures at the moment to go back to traditional exams, and that doesn't help. So traditional methods are very good if you want students to just learn at a very surface level, to regurgitate it in an exam and then to forget it. That doesn't really feel like effective learning, and certainly isn't preparing students, I would argue, for the workplace. All it's doing is it's showing that they can remember what you told them and regurgitate it in a very short space of time, but it doesn't really show that they can apply what they're learning effectively, or that they can do something creative with it. So I think we do need to be careful to make sure our assessments are equally in line with the active learning methods we might use in the classroom. And that brings us to our next little task. So you just need to write down 2 numbers for this one. So the first one is, without sort of consulting with anyone else, I just want you to sort of jot down your estimate of how long it takes a student to answer a single multiple choice question on an exam. We still use a lot of multiple choice questions as exams at Sussex. But just how long do you think it takes a student to answer one question on an exam? So that's your first task. Your second task is this. Now you're going to estimate how long it takes a tutor on average to design a well-structured multiple choice question on an exam. And I know that AI can do some pretty good attempts at multiple choice questions, but we're talking about a really well-structured question that relates to the content, that we feel really does sort of do a good job of trying to test students' knowledge. Now, if my instincts serve me right, your answer to the second one should, in theory, be longer than the answer to the first task. And I mean, if that's not the case, that'd be interesting to know at the end. But certainly I found I was spending an awful long time designing an MCQ exam. I was having to engage with the material again at quite a deep level to think about what the answer options might be, to provide explanations for students for the right and wrong answers and so on. And yet the students were spending probably less than a minute actually answering that question, just choosing A, B, C or D, and that was it. I had no ability to assess whether they really had engaged with the material. It could just be guesswork alone. I had no ability to understand the sort of the depth of their understanding. So what we've been trialing, we've now been doing it for 2 years and we're now into our 3rd year, is we've been doing something called the Design an MCQ assignment. It's not an exam, but the students are now doing the hard work. So we've turned things on their head. So students now have to take the material from each week, that is the reading and the lecture notes, and they have to design their own MCQ. And again, I know what you're thinking, this is probably doable by AI. So we build in a number of what we call golden rules that they have to follow in constructing their multiple choice questions. It's still not AI proof, but it's certainly much harder to do on AI, with AI. In fact, it'd probably take them longer to sort of work out how to do it than it would to just do it themselves. So the idea here is they have to take something from the reading or something from the lecture each week and design their own MCQ question. They have to explain why the right answer is right and why the wrong answers are wrong. And if they really want to demonstrate really sort of effective engagement, they have to show that they can cite evidence to support their explanations. They have to use an image to try and decorate the slide that is relevant to that week's topic. This is just one example. This is from one of my neurodivergent students, showing not only a really good construction of a question that related to our reading for that week, but it also demonstrated really strong engagement. So they really were able to explain nicely and cite evidence in that sort of second part. So the idea is they have a collection of these across the term. They can do one a week, so it spaces the assignment out across the term rather than leaving it to the end. And I just dreaded the feedback because I thought the students are going to hate this, because surely this is going to take them much, much longer than just 1 minute per question. It did, in fact, take them a long time, so they said, but the feedback was incredibly positive. We had most of our, well, I say most, I would say more than 2/3 of our lecture group actually filled in our feedback, and it was overwhelmingly positive. They loved the opportunity to be creative, and really interesting, quite a lot of them said that actually they felt they weren't encouraged to be creative in their previous educational experience. So it was really valued, and some of the work that they submitted was incredible. It did differentiate between sort of students in terms of their sort of engagement and their understanding. So it served that purpose really well. It is something that I think we probably have to modify year on year as AI gets better and better at doing what it does. But nonetheless, at the moment, it seems to be a really effective, really valued, creative type of assignment. So in terms of the students themselves, they loved that one. But generally speaking, that's quite an anomaly and quite surprising, because we know from the literature that students often show resistance to active learning. So they might mistake the flow of a traditional lecture as being indicative of good learning, or they might come to HE with expectations that they're just going to be passive learners, because quite often A-level study really sort of advocates passive learning. There might be a mismatch between the assessment and the activity. So if the assessment is an exam and you're doing lots of active learning, that might not match, and that creates issues. Or sometimes student anxiety can peak. That tends to be where less structure is given to an activity. So rather than just throw an activity out to students and not support them, really it's important to explain what's going on. So this is really what I think we need to remember, is explanations that tell students why we're doing active learning. Explanations that really counter some of their concerns can be really transformational. If we do that early enough in the course, it can really set students up to know why they're doing activities, why they're collaborating in their learning, and so on. It is important to still facilitate and scaffold that learning and make it safe to fail. I think we're very concerned with getting things right all the time, with the model answers, with everything having to be exactly right. But in fact, Dollard and Miller claim that actually failure is a really good sign of actually effective learning. And I think we forget that at times. So making it safe to fail so that we can learn more effectively after. So that brings us back to our bandwagon, because maybe what the bandwagon is not so much active learning, but the strategies. I'm sure we're all aware of times where somebody's come up with an idea and everybody jumps on it, and the result is that students go into every single session and everyone's using the same active learning method or same active learning tool, and it doesn't create a very rich experience for students. It doesn't make for very positive attitudes in our students if they're just doing the same thing in every single session. Again, I'd like to say that that is not strictly true, that this is a bit of a false image, because there are literally hundreds and hundreds of strategies. This is the 100 Ideas for Active Learning book that was published by the Active Learning Network. It's an open access book. It has literally 100 ideas in it. We also have a YouTube channel which has got lots and lots of videos of people sharing different active learning strategies that they've used globally. So there is a really rich source of ideas. I'm just going to mention one that Hannah may well be very familiar with from Sussex days. This is the active essay writing strategy that we use. So essay writing itself, it was very dry. Students would just wait until week 11 and then panic. It didn't really sort of help us to see the skills that students were bringing to it. So we made it into a more active learning style assessment. So the idea is that every 2 weeks in term, we introduce a different stage of the assessment. We do a little practice task. So we do some active learning in the seminar, and then they have 2 weeks to do the same thing in their own assignment. So the first stage is the conversation collage. It's like an ideas board. So I will give them a question. They'll basically collaborate to generate as many ideas as possible, select out the best ones and create a collage. It's an opportunity for them to be really, really creative, to show that they can think outside of the box, that they can talk to other people, collect ideas. The idea is that they don't read anything at all. So idea generation is absolutely key. So we focus in on their creativity in stage 1. Then 2 weeks later, we ask them to select from their own conversation collage that they've done for their portfolio, what are the key ideas that they're going to research. So now they show skills of using search engines, and they also have to look at what evidence there is to support their ideas. So if they can't find any evidence to support it, they can either leave that idea behind, or they can use it as a sort of a part of a concluding paragraph, but they have to be selective, essentially. Then 2 weeks later, they've done all their research. They bring that to their portfolio, because now they're going to plan out their piece of writing. So they have to choose 3 themes, and within each theme, decide, have they got enough to balance arguments or to show that they can think critically? Can they structure it so that they know which theme comes first, second, and third? It really is about taking what they've already found and thinking through sort of the narrative. And then the last stage, of course, is the piece of writing. We did start doing essays. We now do blog posts, and one of those blog posts is going to be published, which is lovely. So they have a chance to really sort of produce a piece of writing that illustrates the sort of the end point of a whole series of planning stages. And when they submit their portfolio, we're able to see if there's a thread running through the portfolio. Obviously, if they've used AI, there won't be a thread between 1, 2, 3, and 4. But other than that, it really sort of provides a very sort of broken down stage by stage approach to actually producing a really effective piece of writing. We do now include a reflection stage on the end, I should say. So that just leaves us with the road ahead for active learning. Where is it going? Where is it heading? What do we think lies on the path ahead? And these are just some of the things that I found being talked about in the literature. So one of the ideas is that actually active learning tasks in the future will be tailored to individual needs. And by that we mean sort of taking into account experience. They'll be personalised. There is a real push for students to request personalised learning. We'll also need to have active learning designs that are flexible, because we need to be able to respond to what's called precarious futures, according to Bain and Ross. With climate change and looking at sustainability arguments and just political and technological changes, then, we need to be flexible in terms of how we design active learning. Scaffolding, choice and support are going to become central. So the role of the tutor is going to be more to scaffold and support active learning. And of course, well-being is going to be a core goal of active learning designs, particularly given the rise in mental health issues both in students and in terms of the sort of the pressure vessel idea in terms of faculty. But I thought what might be really interesting is if I asked AI itself to tell me what it thought was going to happen. And this is what it came up with. So this is just a bog standard ChatGPT view of what's going to happen in the future. Interestingly, it does believe that, or it tells me that active learning will become the default expectation. It will be about designing activities that integrate AI tools productively. So AI won't just be an add-on, it will be an integral part of the design. AI augmented active learning tasks will be used. So AI will be used, for example, to create dialogue, to give feedback, to question. Personalised active learning will happen even in large cohorts. So the idea of just we've got a big group, so we can't do active learning, that will disappear. And things like pacing and reflection and peer support will become embedded. So one idea is that we need to make sure that students don't burn out through, constantly doing activities, that they do have a chance to reflect, that they do have a chance to really sort of pace their learning. And interestingly, authentic portfolio-based assessment is going to dominate. That idea of actually demonstrating a range of skills or demonstrating learning over time rather than just a one time point assessment. But even AI remains a little bit cautious, which is interesting. So these are the 4 issues it thought would still be difficult. So the hardest part of change is cultural, and the claim is it won't be uniform. So you'll see pockets of active learning practice emerging before there's a real culture change. Budgets, no surprise it's picked that up. That will remain a constraint in the development of physical learning spaces. There's a danger of stagnation of assessment if we always remain exam-centric. So there's a real sort of need to think about alternative ways of assessing, understanding and engagement. And the last one, just sustainability. It is an important consideration to avoid creating new inequities. And that's not just in terms of sustainability in terms of AI use, but just sustainability in terms of the environment that students are learning in or with. So just to tie our story together, these I think are my 4 sort of key messages I think that are important. I mean, one is active learning is increasing in its prevalence and importance and its impact across disciplines. So we know that it improves achievement, for example, across different disciplines, and it reduces inequity. So it's been shown to close awarding gaps, for example. It supports like intelligence in terms of actually engaging with the material and being able to do something constructively and creatively with it. The second key point is that institutional support is needed to avoid stagnation and to avoid just thinking that exams are the only option, to avoid AI use. I think we should be encouraged to embrace all the possibilities that active learning offers. Thirdly, the things that make us distinct from AI, they're the very things that underlie the success of active learning: dialogue and imagination and empathy and social connection. And I think it is really important that we do foster that in terms of, graduate outcomes and employability, if nothing else. And finally, just start small and embrace pedagogical vulnerability and collaborate. There have been numerous things that I've tried that just haven't worked, that haven't been that successful, but being able to try them has often led to me developing something that does work as a result of that. So that idea of failure as part of the learning process, I think, applies to us as much as to the students. I do think we need to really sort of try and push back against institutional inertia in all of this and against those sort of entrenched beliefs that I think quite often hold us back. But that is really my sort of call to arms, I guess. And I think that is the point at which I will stop sharing so I can see everybody again. Okay. So over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Wendy. That was really interesting. Really good to hear about some of your examples there. And yeah, has anyone got any questions that they want to put to Wendy?
I have one, if that's all right. Just in your general experience, what kind of exercises do you find are the most effective?
Usually the simplest ones are the most effective. I mean, it doesn't have to involve technology or anything very complicated. It can be something really, really tiny. So like some of the things I've done in like a big lecture theatre is, I don't know if you know the Apprentice programme, and then they do the Apprentice, you're hired or fired or something. You're fired, isn't it, after? And they hold up like red and green cards to show if they agree with the decision the person should have been fired, or green if they think no, that person should have been kept on in the process. And yeah, they were all talking about The Apprentice. We mentioned it in one of the lectures. So the following lecture, I just had some laminated red and green cards, and they all took one. So it's red on one side, green on the other. And we used them to do our voting. And they just absolutely loved it. They were really animated by it. And it just made for that little bit of fun. I think things that induce fun and bring a sort of a light-hearted aspect to it, they just engage with it and learn more as a result. Or another thing that we've done this year is they have little sort of small notebooks that we use in seminars, and we use them for like reflective activities at the end or questions and that sort of thing. And I just said to them, one of the things you can have a go at is decorating the front of your book so that you can find it quicker. And I said, you can be as creative as you like, and anybody who sort of has a go at it, you can have a little creativity badge. And we've created this whole badge scheme on the back of that, so they can get a badge for demonstrating all sorts of skills like creativity. They can reference, they can cite evidence in text correctly, they can submit a formative assessment, things like that. And they are so competitive. Like they all want the badge. And it's just created so much fun and real laughter, because they're looking at each other's books. They're really sort of getting this idea that actually it's good to be creative, and that there's no wrong way of doing something. It's just having a go, taking a risk. Just little things like that can lead to some really quite transformational outcomes, I think. So I don't think it has to be anything very complicated. We tend to think of active learning as requiring like heaps of time to organise, and I'm sure there are plenty of things that require masses of time to develop, but most of the things that I tend to do are fairly quick, fairly easy, not very complicated. Just makes them a bit more accessible as well, I think. It's just good fun for me, and hopefully for them.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
I had a question, Hannah, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it, Tom.
Thanks very much for that talk, Wendy. That was really interesting. Got quite a few notes down there. Well, I was interested to hear more about how the active learning can reduce award gaps, and I wondered if you've come across any evidence or success in reducing like gender award gaps in psychology. So like we have lots of across the UK we have males underperforming versus females in psychology. And have you come across anything useful for addressing that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest ways to reduce the award gap is to do away with exams. That's I think just a lot of my teaching has been and still is in foundation year, and a lot of those students are students who haven't excelled using the traditional exams. They are really effective learners. They are incredible critical thinkers, but they just are not very good at memorizing their material. So, a lot of them will say that, they had to learn model answers and regurgitate them in exams, and they just couldn't remember them. And so they're often students that come in feeling a bit deflated, and yet they often excel during foundation year. And I think part of it is using these more sort of applied assessments, assessments that they can see have meaning to what they want to go on to do, or assessments that have a really obvious, sort of measure of engagement and understanding. And if you explain it to them, like, this is what we're trying to assess here, and this is how it works, and, be creative, take a risk with it, they really embrace that. And I think, we've managed to reduce our awarding gaps quite substantially by moving away from exams and using these more active types of assessment. And, it's not that they are completely AI proof, but it's very difficult to use AI at the moment to do them, because it requires so much effort to get it to do exactly what you need it to do. So it's not just like writing an essay or something like that. It's, following a process of creativity across a term. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing is just the engagement in class. I think it's, if you're just talking at students for an hour, I mean, I switch off even when I'm doing the talking. So goodness only knows what the students are, are doing. But, if you just break it up with little activities, and I think, even things like asking them how it relates to their experience. So we did, like a lecture on psychology of video games this week. And, just about 3 slides in, we just had a little activity where I said, just talk to the person next to you about what consoles you've played on, what gaming experience have you had? How many different types of gaming experience do you have? On the back of that, what do you think some of the issues might be in terms of, this piece of evidence here? Can you think critically about the claims that they're making, given what they did, given their methodology? And immediately I had, sort of loads of people putting their hands up, wanting to contribute their ideas. And I think just we don't draw enough on their experience in order to help them understand what they're facing in terms of their learning. I think quite often traditional sort of methods just say, this is what you need to know, and there's no room for them in it. And I think just active learning brings their experience and their sort of individual situation into the learning itself. It immerses them in the learning, and I think that's really helpful in closing those gaps. They can actually see why it's important to them or how it relates to their experience, and it just makes it easier for them to learn, I think. But yeah, certainly we've reduced ours quite a lot in foundation. Not yet in the year 3, but we're getting there.
Okay, I think we've got a couple of people with their hands up as well. We've got Katie and Carvin. Carvin, to come in first.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you for that session. Really enjoyed it, and really loved the multiple choice example in particular. That was really interesting to learn about. Thank you. I'm from University of Northampton, and actually our campus was designed with sort of, we called it ABL in mind, active blended learning. So small sort of learning sessions, although paradoxically all the plugs are on the perimeter of the room. So that makes it very frustrating if you've got a device. But anyway, one of the things that has broken, I work in access and participation, and one of the things that has broken my heart recently is we commissioned some research, and it found that actually our gaps are smallest when the assessment type is exams. So that was really heartbreaking to learn about. So we're going to do a bit more further investigation into that and try and understand that a bit more. But I just wanted to, I guess, ask one, a reflection, and then secondly, a question. So the reflection is, I completely agree with the element of fun. And you reminded me of a session I had in my first year at university where the lecturer played sociology bingo, where she said at the start, I'm going to say these 3 words throughout the session, and when you hear the 3rd one, shout bingo. And that really sparked a sort of, first of all, attentive side of everyone in the room, and second of all, I guess competitive nature of us was really there. So I think those methods really are effective. One of the things that research that I referenced earlier also found was that those with 100 to 81% attendance were 24 times more likely to pass a module than those with lower attendance. One of my big challenges is, particularly with my APP hat on, is students have very legitimate reasons for not being able to attend. Caring responsibilities, maybe a part-time job, or they're commuting and that costs money. So if their timetable is one where they're only coming in for an hour session, maybe they'd not come in that day to save £40, for example. So I wonder, does the active model, or are there methods within the active approach that lend themselves better to catching up outside of the collaborative environment, if you get what I'm trying to say? So we obviously encourage students to catch up, but what I don't want them to do is have to catch up and speak to your partner, but really they're watching this in their own time. So yeah, what sort of methods lend themselves best to students who can't attend?
It's a massive question. The first thing I was going to say is, just in terms of the exam, it'd be really interesting to see what type of exams they are, because I think that makes quite a big difference. So we're very set on using multiple choice question exams, which I don't think do an awful lot. You know, students can guess a lot of the time and get it right. And yeah, so I think it'd be interesting because there's so much variation even within that. In terms of catching up, I mean, one of the things that we always really sort of struggle with is we record all our lectures. So in theory, if a student misses a lecture, they can just watch the recording. Obviously, they can't participate in the activity because that's done in the lecture. So they see that, like, the results of it, but they don't get to participate, but they can watch it. But in seminars, we have a policy that we don't record any seminars because we want students to feel happy to contribute, particularly if it's like controversial topics and that. But actually that, if anything, acts as a real sort of push for them to try and attend those, to prioritise attendance at those, so that they can really sort of get to grips with the material and work collaboratively and take something away from that. So I think in terms of catching up from those, it is more difficult, but partly because we make it so. And I'm not sure, I mean, I don't think you can replicate some of those activities independently outside of the context of the seminar because they are specifically designed to be collaborative. I think you would have to design a different type of active learning exercise. So something like, you know, at this point, sort of just stop and consider how it relates to your own experience with X, or, you know, can you identify at this point these many factors, you know, that are wrong with this study, or something like that. So you could sort of interject your slides with activity slides, things for them to think about, things for them to have a go at. But I don't think you can replicate completely that collaborative aspect. I think you have to be there to get that experience, you know, that sort of exchange of ideas with another person, for example, or, you know, an activity we did this week, they were working in groups of 3 and they all had to come up with at least 5 different ideas that they'd generated around a key question. And I don't think you can replicate that exactly outside of that. So I think catching up would have to be a different type of active learning activity that just gets them to think about something or gets them to try something out independently. But I don't think that is as effective. It's still effective, but it's not as effective, I don't think.
Thank you.
I don't know if that sort of answers the question or not, but yeah.
No, it's helpful. It's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Katie, I think you were next.
Hiya. Yeah, I think you've kind of partly addressed this, but to what extent is the kind of group work collaborative component of active learning important? I think I might have misunderstood what active learning is.
Well,
I didn't
nobody
realise
really knows.
Yeah, well, to me, it's like you're engaging in an active process while you're learning. That's how I kind of understood it, and perhaps group work being one component of that. But it seemed like you were really like that was the core of it for you. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit around that and how important that element of it is.
I think, I mean, I think the way I sort of see active learning, I think you can do, you know, you can engage in active learning independently, but I don't think it is the most effective way of doing it. And I think just from my own experience, just, you know, as a sort of an academic, I can come up with an idea for an activity, for example, but the most effective activities that I do are ones where I've collaborated with other people who've shared their ideas, their thoughts, their experiences. They might have tried it and fed back. So it is very much, collecting together different experiences, different ideas. I think one of the difficulties of trying to learn just based on your own experience, I mean, obviously you can do it that way, but you have quite a narrow view. And I think sometimes we can get very sort of set on seeing things in a certain way. And I think that collaborative element gives you that idea of alternative perspectives, alternative ideas, or different ways of approaching an activity. And I think that has so much value. And I think in terms of the workplace, there is now so much more push towards, sort of coming together and sharing ideas and brainstorming as a group and that sort of thing. So I think it's sort of setting them up for that reality. Yeah. Whereas, that idea that you can just sort of squirrel away and feel like you're doing something active. Obviously, that does help, and you want students to have that mindset, but I don't think it's the most effective way of doing active learning. I think that collaborative element can be so useful. And just hearing what other people are doing, sharing good practice, that is where the richness comes from. And I think that's what really sort of sparks more creativity. But yeah, that's
so interesting. Yeah, and I think I've been using it without realizing as well. So that's been really positive. Like with my master's project students, we're looking at the inclusivity of MCQs for neurodivergent students. And a lot of them have come with their own experiences of neurodivergent, like, I have ADHD and I experience it like this and but they all have very different experiences and very different. It's really interesting to integrate that into your kind of research design. And okay, so how are we going to look at that across a broad group of people and individual differences and stuff? So it's kind of sparked some really nice discussions. Which is basically what you're saying is that really active component of learning. Definitely. So that's great. Thank you for that.
I'd be interested to hear your results on that one.
Yes, I'm sure we'll try and publish them at some point when we get
that'd be great.
Getting the data.
Okay, Helen, I think you were next.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions I could ask, but I was just wondering, because you were saying about moving away from exams towards like alternative assessments that sound really exciting and allow you to kind of put more creativity in them. I just wondered, we have also incorporated alternative assessments here, but it feels like there's a limit to how much we can do that. So we're still like told that, okay, it has to be at least 50% exams and 40% exams. And I think some of that is the university and some of that might be to do with the BPS still kind of wanting a certain percentage of exams. I wondered what your experiences were at your university regarding those barriers.
Oh, there's so many barriers. It's just, I think one of the things that I think isn't helpful is seeing exams as the only thing you can do because you have a large cohort of students. And that has been the sort of standard response is, well, we'll just do exams because we've got 500 odd students doing this module and there's no other way we can do it. And, it's seen as like the default. And I think exams, I think having a balance there between having some really authentic assessments where students have the opportunity to be creative and maybe balance that with an exam that's structured in a way that enables students to sort of show, that they can apply what they've learned rather than just rote learning regurgitation. So I think like the worst ones are the ones where they just literally regurgitate a lecture. And it's like, do they really understand what that was about? How do I know? There's nothing there that tells me they've really understood that because they're just telling me what I told them. And, it's incredibly boring to mark. And I think it just, demotivates faculty as well, because it's just, I've read the same essay like 50 times. So I think, for some of the assessments that are typically done via exam, we could do them in a more active way. It doesn't mean that, we have to throw out every single exam. So I think if we did every assessment as a real active learning assessment, then we get into that issue of burnout from, you know, sort of overburdening students and overwhelming them with, you know, 10 portfolios a year or something. But I think one of the things that's helpful, and this is being built in more actually at Sussex, is the idea of, if you are going to use any sort of exam, to try and pace it through the term, so that, you know, maybe you're doing like 10 quizzes across the term, one a week, and then you take like the best 5 and you do them in class. But alongside that, you also have like your creative portfolio that you submit at the end. So it's sort of assessing your knowledge in terms of what you can remember. As much as I don't like that, you know, that might be one avenue of assessing, but at the same time, they've got the opportunity to go beyond what you're telling them, to show off their skills of research, or, you know, their sort of creative skills or their critical thinking skills in a portfolio based assessment alongside. So I think it's important to look at the nature of what that exam is like. I think if it is just an MCQ where they're literally just skimming through, ticking A, B, C or D every time, that's not very useful for them or for us, you know. And I think thinking about it in terms of, you know, the workplace, if you go to an employer and they sort of say, you know, well, you know, can you tell us a little bit about what you've done and what you've achieved? And it's like, well, I did MCQ exams. You know, I don't think any employer is going to think, oh, great, you know, that's just what we want. Whereas if you can say, well, look, I did this portfolio and, you know, I was able to sort of use creativity skills here, and I was able to show my critical thinking and my planning and structure here. And I think that has a lot of value for a lot of jobs. So it's sort of giving them, or empowering them, I think, to really be able to demonstrate those skills externally as well. So that was a long roundabout answer. But I think the answer is, I don't like the idea of just doing exams. And I think there is a danger that we're slipping back to that. Sort of, you know, after COVID, it was all, let's think about all these new exciting things we can do. And now it's slowly slipping back to, oh, we've got large cohorts, you know, money's tight, you know, we've got a reduction in staff. Now let's go back to exams. It's the only thing we can do. It's like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
So,
it's not always less work either. Like for one of the big modules I teach on, we have half alternative assessment, which most of the students have said they love doing because it's very practical and creative. And then it's half in-person exams and marking those, and reading, writing, and them having to write in person was not fun. It wasn't fun for anybody.
Yeah, no, and I think just the more we take the fun out of learning, the less motivated they are to attend, and then, you know, the less they achieve, and it's just like a vicious cycle. But I think just if they can see the value in what they're doing, and if they can see that the assessment is of use to them and it gives them a chance to show off what they're learning, I think that makes a massive difference. And I think just, the more that the assessment's tailored to that sort of approach, the better, really.
Yeah, I agree.
Do we have any more questions? I've got a question, but I'm just going to see if anybody else has one before I. Okay, I was just going to say, you mentioned, Wendy, that you got feedback from the students about kind of having that opportunity to be creative that they hadn't had before and things. I just wondered, what was the feedback like around things like doing lots of group work? Do you often get kind of resistance to group work? We tend to find that we get quite a lot of resistance to students having to do group work here. And also, do they recognise or do they feed back about it feeding into their student experience in terms of supporting their feelings of belonging and things like that, in terms of working together in groups?
I think there's two elements. That one, I think it's important to start it right from the word go and to explain why you're asking them to work in a group. I think just saying just get in a group and do this doesn't work, because you get some who are just really, really quiet and sit back and do nothing, and then you get like one person who dominates. But if you just say, like, we're going to be working in small groups so that, you're not having to sort of feel like you're being tested, or, it's not like a sort of an isolating experience. This is so that you can get to know each other. I want you to sort of exchange names at the beginning, write them down in your little seminar book so you've got them there as a record, and then give them a task where it's, I forget what they call it now, but there's, you know, the emphasis is not on them, it's on the task. So you have to have, I think for effective group work, you have to have something on the table that the group can look at, because if you don't have that and they're all looking at each other, they just opt out. And I think that has been like a real game changer for me. So like when we did the group work this week, I had you know, one of these sticky whiteboard sheets. I gave each group one of those, and I told them their first job was to go and find a wall where they could stick their whiteboard sheet up. And their job was to really focus on that and fill it with their ideas. And because they had that to focus on, they're not looking so much at each other, but they're talking without really realising how much they're talking. Their focus is on that sheet. And I think the same thing, like if they're sitting at a table and you give them something to use as part of the activity, whether that's a sheet of paper, pens, anything, their sort of focus is on that. I think people don't work effectively in groups when they feel like the whole group is looking at them. They tend just not to speak up rather than do that. Another example that we do, you know, the moon task, where you give them a list of items that they could keep them, like they're stranded on the moon. They have to decide which of these items they're going to take. And they have to work collaboratively as a group. It's one of the old NASA things. If I asked them to do that, just to talk about what they thought might be important and show it on a slide, I don't think it would work. I have tried that and it was not very effective. But then the next year, I actually gave each group a sheet with the list of items on, rather than putting it on the slide. So they had it in front of them on the desk. And I gave them another sheet where they had to write down their group solutions, and suddenly they all started chatting, and they were looking at these items and chatting as they were going through the items. And I think just that idea of, you know, they really are very averse to having the spotlight put on them, but if you put the spotlight on the task, they seem to talk a lot more and get on a lot more. Getting them to exchange names right at the beginning, you know, just making it a sort of a normal part of what happens. You know, I normally do a sort of a group or a paired activity in every seminar now, because they know that that's the expectation. They get used to who's in the group, they learn each other's names, and I think it does sort of support that sense of belonging. You know, you often get some that are quieter than others, but and so I think it's just about taking the spotlight off of an individual and just giving them something to look at together or to work on together on the table, on the wall, just so that they're not sitting just talking to each other with one person, having everyone looking at them. I think that's I mean, even I don't like that. But,
Thanks, Wendy. Do we have